At 3:52 in the morning on the 25th of October 1944, the battleship US West Virginia opened fire in total darkness. The target was more than 11 miles away. Nobody on West Virginia needed to see it. 42 minutes earlier, her Mark 8 fire control radar had acquired a large Japanese ship approaching through Surigao Strait. The radar continued tracking while American destroyers attacked from both sides of the channel. By the time the range had fallen to roughly 22,800 yards, West Virginia's gunnery computer had a complete firing solution. 8 16-inch guns fired the first salvo. 35 seconds later came the second. The American Action Report recorded the first salvo as a straddle with hits. The second landed around the same target. Salvos followed at intervals of roughly 40 seconds. Ahead of West Virginia was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's flagship, the battleship Yamashiro. Behind her lay a Japanese formation that had already been cut apart by torpedoes. Around her were ships burning in the darkness. In front of her stood 6 American battleships, 8 cruisers, dozens of destroyers, and a firing line positioned across the northern exit of the strait. West Virginia's radar had first detected the approaching force at approximately 44,000 yards. Her Mark 8 set began tracking at about 41,000. When she finally fired, the night itself offered the Japanese no protection. West Virginia's report would later record that every one of her first 13 full salvos straddled the target. At 4:12, the radar return disappeared. Yamashiro was going down. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained to make darkness an American weakness. On this night, Japan sailed its battleships into darkness and discovered that darkness belonged to someone else. The Battle of Surigao Strait is usually remembered for one phrase: crossing the T. It was the classic geometry of battleship warfare. Nishimura's ships advanced north in column, while Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf placed his battle line across their path. The Americans could bring broadside batteries to bear, while the Japanese leading ships could answer with only a fraction of their guns. That description is correct. It is also incomplete, because the decisive American advantage that night was not simply where the battleships were positioned. It was what those battleships could detect, track, and hit before their opponents could fight effectively in return. West Virginia tracked the enemy electronically from tens of thousands of yards away. Her fire control radar maintained the solution through darkness, smoke, gun flashes, maneuvering destroyers, and the confusion of a night action. Tennessee and California also possessed modernized fire control systems. Maryland had older equipment and used the splashes of West Virginia's gunfire to help obtain her own firing data. Pennsylvania never fired her 14-inch main battery because her older radar could not produce an adequate solution before the action moved beyond her opportunity. Mississippi eventually fired a single battleship salvo near the end. It became the last salvo fired by an American battleship against another battleship. 6 battleships had been waiting. Only some could exploit the darkness completely. That difference matters. Surigao Strait was not merely the last great gun duel of the battleship era. It was a demonstration that the gun itself was no longer enough. The winning system was now the gun connected to radar, plotting equipment, communications, doctrine, destroyer attacks, and commanders who knew how to make all of them work together. The Japanese brought battleships into the strait. The Americans had constructed a machine for destroying them. But the destruction of Nishimura's force did not begin at Surigao Strait. It began more than 2 years earlier, in another patch of black water hundreds of miles to the southeast. There, the advantage belonged to Japan. On the night of the 8th and 9th of August, 1942, Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a Japanese cruiser force toward the Allied ships guarding the Guadalcanal landings. The Americans had radar. That did not save them. Japanese doctrine had been built around night combat long before the war began. Crews practiced identification in darkness, coordinated maneuvers without depending on radio traffic, trained lookouts aggressively, and prepared to launch torpedoes before illuminating an enemy with gunfire. The United States Navy had spent much of the interwar period treating night battle as something better avoided. Japan had treated it as an opportunity. At Savo Island, the difference was catastrophic. Japanese ships slipped through the Allied screen and attacked with torpedoes and gunfire at close range. 3 American heavy cruisers were lost. The Australian heavy cruiser Canberra was so badly damaged that she had to be sunk. More than 1,000 Allied sailors were killed. The Japanese force escaped, with no ship lost in the battle. It was one of the worst surface defeats in United States naval history. And it established a pattern. Darkness in the Solomons belonged to Japanese destroyers and cruisers. The weapon most responsible for that fear was the Type 93 oxygen torpedo, later known to the Americans as the Long Lance. It could travel farther than American commanders initially believed possible. It carried a massive warhead. Japanese crews could launch spreads before opening gunfire, leaving American ships to react to shells while torpedoes were already moving invisibly toward them. American radar existed, but equipment alone did not produce victory. At Savo Island, radar picket destroyers failed to detect Mikawa's approach in time. On some American ships, radar performance was poor. On others, the information was misunderstood, ignored, or isolated from the commander who needed it. Later battles produced different results. At Cape Esperance in October 1942, American ships equipped with newer SG surface search radar helped surprise a Japanese bombardment force. It was an improvement. It was not yet mastery. The following month brought more brutal night actions around Guadalcanal. Radar-directed American gunfire could be devastating. But formations became confused. Friendly ships crossed fields of fire. Commanders struggled to build a coherent tactical picture from information appearing on new electronic displays. The technology was advancing faster than doctrine. So the United States Navy changed the doctrine. By 1944, official American night fighting instructions stated the transformation plainly. Radar had changed the concept of night action. Darkness was no longer something that automatically reduced a fleet's ability to fight. If radar was used correctly, darkness could conceal the fleet that possessed the better radar while exposing the fleet that did not. The old relationship had been reversed. The Japanese had spent years perfecting the ability to see with human eyes at night. The Americans were learning that they no longer had to see at all. The Japanese advantage had never depended upon one weapon. It was a system. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Pacific War expecting that an advancing American fleet would have to cross thousands of miles of ocean before approaching Japan. Japanese submarines would reduce it. Carrier aircraft would reduce it again. Cruisers and destroyers would attack at night. Then the surviving American battleships would meet the Japanese battle line in a final decisive engagement. Night combat was therefore not an accessory to Japanese naval strategy. It was one of its foundations. Destroyer crews trained for complicated attacks in darkness. Optical equipment was excellent. Lookouts were selected and trained intensely. Ships practiced coordinated torpedo launches that could place dozens of weapons into an enemy formation. And the Type 93 made those attacks exceptionally dangerous. American commanders learned that fact through losses. The battles around Guadalcanal repeatedly produced the same terrifying experience. An American force would encounter Japanese ships. The Japanese would maneuver. Minutes later, torpedoes would arrive from ranges American officers had not considered practical. Sometimes the launching ships were already withdrawing by the time the weapons struck. At the Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942, an American cruiser force surprised Japanese destroyers with radar and opened fire first. By conventional logic, the Americans had won the opening move. Then the torpedoes arrived. Northampton sank. Minneapolis lost her bow. New Orleans lost everything forward of turret number 2. Pensacola was badly damaged. The Japanese lost one destroyer. Fire control radar had given the Americans detection and gunfire advantage. Japanese torpedo doctrine had still delivered the harder blow. That was the problem the United States Navy had to solve. Radar could locate an enemy. It could produce range. Fire control radar could help aim the guns. But if a commander used those advantages badly, if cruisers approached too closely, if destroyers were not positioned correctly, if formations became confused, Japan could still turn one torpedo salvo into a disaster. 2 years later, Nishimura's battleships represented the surviving pieces of that older Japanese system. Yamashiro and Fuso were not new ships. Both had been commissioned during the First World War. Both had been modernized heavily before the Pacific War. Each carried 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets. Their appearance was unmistakable. Tall pagoda masts rose above long hulls and multiple main battery turrets. Against another battleship formation in daylight, 12 14-inch guns remained a serious weapon. The Japanese also possessed Mogami, a heavy cruiser carrying 10 8-inch guns after conversion from her original 6.1-inch armament. 4 destroyers, Shigure, Michishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo, completed Nishimura's immediate force. Those destroyers mattered because they carried the weapon that had repeatedly punished American surface forces. Torpedoes. If Nishimura could enter Leyte Gulf, his targets would not primarily be American battleships. They would be the invasion shipping supporting General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Transports, cargo vessels. Landing ships, supply concentrations. Ships crowded into waters near Leyte. The Japanese operation was desperate because the strategic situation was desperate. American troops had landed on Leyte on the 20th of October. If the Philippines were lost, Japan's connection with the oil fields and raw materials of Southeast Asia would be severed. The Imperial Japanese Navy therefore activated G1, its attempt to destroy the American invasion fleet with converging naval forces. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would approach through the central Philippines and San Bernardino Strait. A carrier force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would draw Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north. Nishimura would come through Surigao Strait from the south. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima would follow with another force. On paper, the Americans could be struck from different directions nearly simultaneously. In reality, timing, communications, distance, and American resistance pulled the operation apart. But Nishimura continued north. That decision placed 2 Japanese battleships inside a narrow waterway against an opponent that had spent 2 years learning how to kill ships in darkness. Oldendorf's force looked overwhelming. That can make the battle appear inevitable. It was not. His ships had another assignment before they became a battle line. They had been supporting the invasion. Battleships that would soon fire armor-piercing shells at Japanese warships had spent days firing ammunition against targets on Leyte. Cruisers had done the same. Destroyers had screened the landing area and conducted other duties. Ammunition was not unlimited. Fuel was not unlimited. Oldendorf could not assume that Surigao Strait was the only threat. American commanders knew major Japanese forces were moving toward Leyte from more than one direction. Kurita's central force contained the battleship Yamato and other heavy ships. What Oldendorf did not know during the night was exactly what would happen to the north. That uncertainty shaped his decisions. The American battle line consisted of West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. 5 had been at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. West Virginia and California had been sunk there. Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania had been damaged. Now those ships were waiting across the northern exit of Surigao Strait. The symbolism would later be impossible to miss. But symbolism did not load magazines. West Virginia's own action report stated that conserving armor-piercing ammunition influenced when she opened fire. Her commander had authorization to fire at greater distance. He waited. The radar already had the target. The solution already existed. But friendly destroyers were still operating between the American battle line and the Japanese. The captain wanted identification to be certain. At 3:32, orders came permitting fire at 26,000 yards. West Virginia held. At 3:45, an explosion appeared in the target area. At 3:49, the range had fallen to around 24,000 yards. Still she held. The ship's command team confirmed that American destroyers were clear. The target remained steady on radar. At approximately 3:52, West Virginia fired. This was not rapid, blind gunfire into a dark channel. It was controlled expenditure. Every armor-piercing shell mattered. At the end of her initial firing sequence, West Virginia's report recorded only 110 armor-piercing projectiles remaining. Her gunnery spacers were also brutally hot. Ventilation had to be reduced or shut down when the ammunition train was operating. Men handling powder and projectiles in the lower spaces were becoming exhausted. Mechanical problems appeared. Shell hoists in 2 turrets developed casualties. Some guns missed salvos. Projectile supply became more difficult after the 12th salvo. This matters because Surigao Strait is often described as technologically effortless. It was not. Radar did not remove friction. It did not cool magazines. It did not repair hoists. It did not identify every radar return automatically. It did not prevent American commanders from worrying about friendly destroyers crossing the firing line. Technology gave Oldendorf information. Training turned that information into controlled violence. And ammunition scarcity made accuracy more valuable than volume. West Virginia would ultimately fire 89 armor-piercing and 4 high-capacity 16-inch projectiles during the action. 93 shells. Not thousands. 93. That is what radar changed. The Americans no longer had to fill the darkness with shells and hope something was there. They could measure the darkness first. The most important American decision at Surigao Strait was made before Yamashiro entered the channel. Oldendorf did not intend to fight one battle. He intended to make the Japanese survive several different battles in sequence. The first layer was composed of motor torpedo boats. Roughly 30 were stationed in groups across the southern approaches. They were not expected to stop 2 battleships by themselves. Their first value was information. They extended American eyes far down the strait. At 11:10 on the night of the 24th of October, PT-127 reported contact with approaching Japanese ships southeast of Bohol. More reports followed. The force was moving north. Then the attacks began. Small wooden boats carrying torpedoes moved against battleships and cruisers. Japanese guns replied. Searchlights swept across the darkness. Star shells appeared. One American PT boat, PT-493, would be lost. The attacks caused limited damage to Nishimura's force. That was not the same as causing no effect. Every report went north. Course, speed, composition, position, the Japanese were being tracked into the channel. Behind the PT boats waited American destroyers. They were not stationed beside the battleships. They were sent south. That difference was critical. Destroyer Squadron 54 moved down opposite sides of the strait. Remy, McGowan, and Melvin approached from the east. McDermott and Monson came from the west. Radar contact was established. The enemy column continued north at roughly 18 to 20 knots. Then the destroyers launched. They did not remain to conduct a prolonged gun duel. They fired torpedoes and withdrew at high speed behind smoke. More American destroyers followed. Arunta, Killen, and Beale attacked. Then Hutchins, Daly, and Bay. Desron 56 would launch another attack from the eastern side. The Japanese formation was not moving toward a single American line. It was passing through layers. PT boats. Destroyers, more destroyers. Cruisers, battleships, and each layer was positioned so that the next would receive a Japanese force that was more damaged, more disorganized, and more thoroughly located than before. The first destroyer torpedo attacks changed the battle. At approximately 3:16, observers saw a major explosion. Fuso was hit and fell out of formation. Yamagumo was destroyed. Michishio was crippled. Asaguma was damaged severely. Yamashiro took torpedo damage but continued. The exact sequence of individual hits has produced disagreement in post-war accounts because darkness, multiple simultaneous attacks, exploding ships, and incomplete Japanese records made reconstruction difficult. The larger fact is not disputed. Nishimura's formation entered the destroyer zone as a coherent column. It did not leave it that way. American destroyers had used radar to approach, launch torpedoes from both sides of the strait, and withdraw before the heavy ships began firing. The weapon Japan had used so successfully against Americans in 1942 was now coming from American launchers. That was the unnoticed decision. Oldendorf did not wait for Japanese battleships to reach his battleships. He made them pay an entrance fee for every mile they moved north. And the fee was collected in torpedoes. At 2:40 in the morning, Destroyer Squadron 54 had radar contact. At 2:48, Daly's SG radar detected the Japanese force at roughly 30,400 yards. The plot showed ships moving north at about 17 knots. From that moment forward, Nishimura was navigating through an American tactical picture that he could not see. That distinction is easy to miss. A radar contact is not simply a dot. Once repeated plots establish bearing, range, direction, the enemy's movement becomes predictable. A commander can estimate where the target will be minutes later. Torpedo directors can calculate interception. Gunfire systems can develop solutions. Friendly formations can maneuver around an enemy that may not know exactly where those formations are. At 3:07, another American destroyer group began its approach. At 3:27, Arunta and her section launched torpedoes from around 7,000 yards. At 3:29, Hutchins fired 5. At 3:32, Daly fired 5 at a large radar target 10,700 yards away. At 3:35, Bache fired another 5. The destroyers then turned away. At 3:44, Daly's crew saw 3 large explosions. The ship's action analysis calculated that its torpedoes had traveled the correct distance and time to account for those impacts. The Japanese response was violent. Major and minor caliber guns fired in multiple directions. Star shells went up. Searchlights appeared. But the geometry of the action kept getting worse. Nishimura had to continue north if he intended to reach Leyte Gulf. Turning around meant abandoning the mission. Continuing meant moving toward a force whose exact size and disposition he could not fully know. Yamashiro continued. Mogami continued. Shigure continued. Behind them, Fuso was lost. Destroyers were burning or sinking. The formation was becoming something different from what had entered the strait. Then American cruiser gunfire joined the action. Shells came from the flanks. The narrow waterway that had guided Nishimura toward his objective now limited his alternatives. Ahead of him was Oldendorf's battle line. 6 battleships steamed back and forth across the northern end of the strait. Their broadside batteries remained trained south. At 3:10, West Virginia's Mark 8 radar acquired the target. The report later noted that it never lost the target until after firing ended. For 42 minutes, while American destroyers attacked and withdrew, that radar return kept approaching. 30,000 yards. 26,000. 24,000. 22,800. Nishimura had spent his career in a navy that regarded night battle as a place where training could erase numerical disadvantage. Now a large American battleship was holding him on an electronic screen through complete darkness. The Americans did not need illumination. They needed clearance. Once the destroyers were safely out of the firing line, the next phase could begin. CTA, it took 8 hours to get every name and number in this segment right. The after-action reports, the loss tables, the squadron rosters. If that work is worth something to you, hit the like button. It's the only signal that tells us to keep doing it this way instead of the fast way. 2 years earlier, an American commander entering a night battle had worried about what he could not see. At Surigao Strait, Oldendorf could build his plan around exactly that condition. American war instructions issued in 1944 stated that radar had changed previous concepts of night action. That was not theory anymore. The ships waiting for Nishimura embodied it. A surface search radar could locate ships. A combat information center could combine those contacts with reports from PT boats, destroyers, and other vessels. Plotters could establish tracks. Fire control radar could then provide the range and bearing required by a battleship's gunnery system. The target did not have to be illuminated. There did not have to be moonlight. Searchlights were unnecessary. That created a tactical asymmetry. An optically controlled force benefits when it can see. A radar-controlled force may benefit when nobody can. The night of the 24th and 25th produced exactly those conditions. Early in the evening there had been moonlight and good visibility. Before Nishimura reached the main American force, the moon went down. Squalls and overcast turned the northern strait black. Lightning occasionally broke the darkness. It looked like bad battleship weather. For the Americans, it was almost ideal. Oldendorf had also arranged his ships in the oldest battleship geometry available. Across the T, Nishimura was coming north in column. Oldendorf's battleships were moving east and west across the top of that column. The Japanese leading ships therefore presented themselves along a narrow axis, while the American battle line could use full broadsides. Normally, crossing the T required visual awareness, maneuver, and timing. At Surigao Strait, radar made the geometry measurable before most American gunners could see a target. There was another difference. The American system separated detection from illumination. Japanese ships could fire star shells or use searchlights, but illumination also revealed them. Radar transmitted energy, but Japanese surface forces did not possess an equivalent ability to turn those emissions into an accurate battleship firing solution at the same range. Oldendorf could therefore remain physically invisible while tactically informed. That is what happened aboard West Virginia. At 3:04, the enemy appeared on her surface search radar around 44,000 yards away. At 3:10, Mark 8 fire control radar acquired the target. The ship's plotting equipment tracked it continuously. When fire opened, radar performed the spotting. The first salvo needed no visual correction. The second did not wait for a human observer to distinguish splashes around a distant silhouette. Radar operators could see the target return and shell splashes on their screens. Corrections went directly into the fire control process. After the first 2 salvos, West Virginia shifted to rapid salvo fire. The average interval for the first 13 salvos was approximately 41 seconds. Every one of those 13 was recorded as a straddle. Consider what that meant aboard Yamashiro. The Japanese battleship had survived torpedo attacks. She was trying to continue north. The Americans ahead were difficult or impossible to see clearly. Then 16-inch shells began arriving around the ship. Another salvo followed. Then another. Then the fire of additional battleships and cruisers joined them. Yamashiro could shoot north. But West Virginia already knew where Yamashiro would be when the shells arrived. The technology had removed the Japanese night fighting advantage from the most important phase of the battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy had once trained to use darkness to get close enough to unleash torpedoes before an American commander understood what was happening. At Surigao Strait, the Americans knew where Nishimura was for almost an hour before the battleship line fired. The doctrine had not merely improved. The relationship between darkness and information had reversed. At 3:49, West Virginia's range to the target was approximately 24,000 yards. Her captains still had not fired. American destroyers had been operating in the same direction as the enemy. He wanted certainty. The fire control team reported that it had maintained the same large target for a considerable period. Combat Information Center confirmed the destroyers were clear. Then came the order. Commence firing. At 3:52 and 10 seconds, West Virginia's forward and after turrets fired 8 16-inch armor-piercing projectiles. The range recorded in the ship's chronology was approximately 22,800 yards. The gunnery tables list opening gun range as about 22,400. Either way, the target was more than 10 nautical miles away. The first salvo crossed the darkness. There was no brightly illuminated battleship for the American gunners to watch. Radar performed the work. West Virginia's report recorded the first salvo as a straddle with numerous hits. 35 seconds after the first salvo, the second went out. The gunnery officer announced another hit. At 3:53 and 37 seconds, the third salvo fired. At 3:54 and 26 seconds, the fourth. At 3:55 and 11 seconds, the fifth. At 3:55 and 49 seconds, the sixth. A visible flare appeared on the target. West Virginia was not alone. Tennessee opened with her 14-inch guns. California joined. Maryland fired using less capable radar and information drawn partly from West Virginia's shell splashes. American cruisers were already firing. The flashes of heavy guns illuminated the battle line for fractions of seconds and disappeared again. Yamashiro returned fire, but the Japanese battleship was no longer fighting the kind of night battle for which the Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared. The enemy was not appearing suddenly at close range. There was no single American column waiting to be torn open by a torpedo salvo. There was a firing line. There were radar plots. There were cruisers on the flanks. There were destroyers withdrawing after their attacks. There were burning Japanese ships behind Yamashiro. And there were 14 and 16-inch shells arriving from ahead. At 3:56, West Virginia observers saw explosions on the target. At 3:57 and 19 seconds, another salvo left the ship. At 3:58, the gunnery officer reported that the target appeared stopped and that its radar return was becoming smaller. At 3:58 and 12 seconds, another salvo. At 3:58 and 53 seconds, another. At 3:59 and 42 seconds, another. The battleship was firing faster than one full heavy salvo per minute. At 4:00 and 24 seconds came the 12th. At 4:01 and 5 seconds came another. The target remained within the radar solution. Behind the gunnery plot, men handled projectiles weighing more than a ton, and powder charges in hot compartments with inadequate ventilation. Shell hoist failures began interfering with the firing sequence. West Virginia continued. At approximately 4:02, the American battle line changed course, and West Virginia checked fire. The target was turning. American radar reported it reversing course. Yamashiro had reached the northern end of Surigao Strait. It would never reach Leyte Gulf. The ship turned back south into the channel through which it had just advanced. It was burning. It had been torpedoed. It had been struck by heavy gunfire. Mogami was also badly damaged. Shigure remained in the chaos. To the south were the wrecks and disabled ships of Nishimura's formation. To the north were Oldendorf's battleships. At 4:05, West Virginia's Combat Information Center listed the target speed as 0. At 4:11, radar operators saw the return bloom and begin to fade. At 4:12, it disappeared. Yamashiro sank with Vice Admiral Nishimura aboard. Only a tiny fraction of her crew survived. The entire period between West Virginia's first salvo and the disappearance of the target on radar was approximately 20 minutes. But even that understates what had happened. Nishimura's force had been under systematic attack long before the battleships opened fire. The PT boats had reported it. Destroyers had torpedoed it. Cruisers had shelled it. Then the American battle line finished the sequence. Fuso was gone. Yamashiro was gone. Yamagumo was gone. Michishio was gone. Asagumo would be finished during the withdrawal. Mogami was crippled and would not survive the day. Shigure escaped. Behind Nishimura came Vice Admiral Shima's force. It arrived not to reinforce a battle, but to discover its remains. Shima's light cruiser Abukuma had already been torpedoed by a PT boat and forced to drop back. His flagship Nachi entered the northern strait and encountered the damaged Mogami retreating south. The ships collided. Nachi's bow was damaged. Mogami's condition became worse. Shima looked north into flashes, fires, wreckage, reports, and uncertainty. Then he reversed course. The second Japanese group withdrew. The southern attack on Leyte had ended. CTA What Happens in the Next 12 Minutes is the part most documentaries skip entirely. If you want the rest of this war told the same way, from the records, not the legends, subscribe before it starts. At daylight, Surigao Strait contained the physical result. Smoke columns rose from the water. American destroyer reports described burning or sinking ships across the channel. Survivors were in the sea. Oil covered sections of the surface. The Japanese southern force had not merely been defeated. Its leading formation had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. 5 ships from Nishimura's immediate force were lost in or as a direct consequence of the surface action. Battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, and destroyers Yamagumo, Michishio, and Asagumo. Mogami escaped the immediate gun battle only as a cripple. She had suffered severe gunfire damage, her bridge had been devastated, and her steering was compromised. After colliding with Nachi during Shima's retreat, Mogami continued south. American aircraft attacked her later that morning. Her crew eventually abandoned her, and a Japanese destroyer finished the wreck. Shigure alone escaped from Nishimura's original 7 ships. Shima's force survived the strait, largely because Shima turned around. Even then, it paid for entering the approach. Abukuma, torpedoed earlier, was later sunk by American aircraft. The Japanese plan required coordination between forces coming from different directions. Surigao Strait demonstrated the opposite. Nishimura arrived first, Shima arrived too late to help him. Kurita came through San Bernardino Strait at a different point in the battle, and unexpectedly fell upon American escort carriers off Sama. Ozawa succeeded in pulling Halsey's carrier force north. Pieces of G1 therefore worked. The whole did not. At Surigao Strait, that failure of coordination allowed Oldendorf to concentrate overwhelming force against Nishimura. But overwhelming numbers alone do not explain how little damage the American battle lines suffered. The American battleships themselves received no meaningful Japanese gunfire damage during the principal engagement. West Virginia reported no enemy-inflicted casualties. The Japanese had sailed into a position where the Americans could attack repeatedly before receiving an effective battleship response. The contrast with 1942 was complete. At Savo Island, Japanese cruisers had entered an Allied defensive screen and produced destruction before the Americans understood the situation. At Tassafaronga, Japanese destroyers had absorbed the first American gunfire and still launched torpedoes that crippled a cruiser formation. At Surigao Strait, American destroyers delivered the torpedo ambush. American radar maintained the tactical picture. American battleships waited across the exit. The Japanese formation was the one reacting. The shift had taken 26 months. It was not produced by a single invention. Radar existed at Savo. The difference was integration. By late 1944, radar information was entering combat information centers, being plotted continuously, passed to commanders, used to direct destroyer approaches, and fed into fire control systems that could put heavy shells onto a target invisible to the human eye. Japan still possessed dangerous ships. It still possessed excellent weapons. It still possessed crews willing to press an attack into overwhelming opposition. What it no longer possessed was control of the night, and a navy built partly around mastery of night combat had discovered that fact in the narrowest possible place. A decisive victory can hide mistakes. Surigao Strait contained several. American destroyers repeatedly crossed dangerous torpedo tracks. Daly recorded 2 torpedoes passing close across her bow during the attack. The water was so close to the detonation path that crewmen could see bubbles and disturbed water alongside the ship. Later, friendly gunfire created an even greater tragedy. US Albert W. Grant participated in the destroyer attack against Nishimura's force. During the confused engagement, she was hit repeatedly. Some shells were Japanese. Many were American. Cruisers firing into the darkness struck the destroyer while she was operating near the enemy. 38 men aboard Grant were killed, and more than 100 wounded. She survived. The episode is important because it shows what radar did not solve. A radar screen could display contacts. It could not always identify those contacts perfectly. Fast destroyers maneuvering between 2 battle lines created exactly the kind of problem that could turn accurate gunfire into friendly fire. Oldendorf understood that danger. It helps explain why West Virginia's captain waited before opening fire. He had a radar solution well before 3:52. What he lacked was complete confidence that American destroyers were no longer mixed with the enemy. The delay was not technological weakness. It was tactical discipline. There was also the ammunition problem. The American ships had been supporting the Leyte landings for days. Armor-piercing rounds were limited. Destroyers were expending torpedoes that could not be replaced during the battle. If another Japanese force appeared immediately after Nishimura, Oldendorf would have to fight with depleted magazines. That threat became real within hours. At dawn, reports arrived that Kurita's central force had passed through San Bernardino Strait and was attacking American escort carriers off Samar. Oldendorf's heavy ships were south. Their destroyers had spent most of their torpedoes. The battleships had fired precious armor-piercing ammunition. Fuel was becoming a concern. The great victory at Surigao Strait, therefore, existed beside a potentially catastrophic gap elsewhere. For a short period on the morning of the 25th, the American 7th Fleet faced the possibility that defeating one Japanese battleship force had opened the door for another to reach the landing area from the north. The small escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts off Samar prevented that outcome. Surigao Strait was clean. The wider Battle of Leyte Gulf was not. That matters when the ledger is written. Oldendorf's plan worked because every layer executed its assigned role. But American success remained dependent upon imperfect people, limited ammunition, uncertain communications, and decisions made in darkness. Radar did not make the battle safe. It made the violence more precise. The sequence is worth reducing to dates and minutes. The 20th of October 1944, American troops landed on Leyte. The Japanese Navy activated its attempt to destroy the invasion fleet. The 24th of October, Nishimura's southern force approached Surigao Strait. By evening, Oldendorf had deployed 6 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and PT boats to deny the passage into Leyte Gulf. At 11:10 that night, PT-127 reported the approaching enemy. The 25th of October. Shortly after midnight, PT boats continued reporting and attacking. At approximately 2:40, American destroyers had radar contact. At 2:48, Daly tracked the Japanese at roughly 30,400 yards. Around 3:00, the first major destroyer torpedo attacks began. At 3:10, West Virginia's Mark 8 fire control radar acquired a target. At approximately 3:16, a major explosion was observed during the torpedo phase. Fuso fell out of Nishimura's formation. Japanese destroyers were hit. Yamashiro continued north. More American destroyer attacks followed. At 3:52, West Virginia fired her first 16-inch salvo. Tennessee, California, Maryland, cruisers, and other ships joined the engagement. Yamashiro turned south under heavy fire. At 4:12, West Virginia's radar target disappeared. Nishimura's flagship had sunk. Shima entered the wreckage behind him, collided with the damaged Mogami, and withdrew. By daylight, the southern approach to Leyte Gulf was blocked by wrecks rather than Japanese battleships. Less than 5 hours had passed since the first PT boat contact. The battleship gunfight itself had lasted only minutes. A Japanese force built to attack the Leyte anchorage had been detected, reported, torpedoed, shelled, turned around, and destroyed before it could reach the transports it had come to kill. 4 factors explain why Surigao Strait became an execution rather than a conventional battleship engagement. First, layered defense Oldendorf did not place all of his strength in one line and wait. The Japanese were forced through successive barriers. PT boats found and harassed them. Destroyers attacked with torpedoes from both sides. Additional destroyers followed. Cruisers added gunfire. Only after the Japanese formation had been damaged and disorganized did it reach the American battleships. Each defensive layer reduced the problem for the layer behind it. Fuso never reached the battle line as an intact participant. Several Japanese destroyers never reached it at all. Yamashiro arrived already damaged. The battleships were therefore not asked to defeat Nishimura's original force. They were asked to finish what the light forces had prepared. Radar did more than warn the Americans. Its information moved through the fleet. PT boat reports established the approach. Destroyer SG radar measured course and speed. Combat information centers tracked contacts. Battleships maintained electronic plots. Fire control radar then converted a distant return into gun elevation and bearing. On West Virginia, the Mark 8 tracked the enemy continuously before the first salvo and radar spotted the fall of shot after firing began. That distinction separated Surigao Strait from earlier American night actions, where radar existed, but tactical information was fragmented. By 1944, the equipment had become part of the command system. Nishimura's objective required him to continue north through Surigao Strait. Oldendorf knew where that passage ended. That allowed him to position his battle line across the exit. Crossing the T did not guarantee destruction by itself, but combined with radar, it created a nearly ideal engagement. The Americans could train broadside batteries south while the Japanese approached in column. The Americans knew the range before firing. The leading Japanese ships absorbed concentrated fire. The narrow geography restricted Nishimura's options at the moment he most needed room to maneuver. Japan could replace ships only slowly by 1944. It could replace experienced crews even less easily. The United States had spent 2 years converting defeats into doctrine. New radar sets entered service. Combat information centers matured. Night fighting instructions changed. Ships were rebuilt. Crews trained around new equipment. West Virginia herself embodied the process. Japanese aircraft had put her on the bottom at Pearl Harbor. She was raised, repaired, modernized, given improved radar and fire control systems, and returned to battle. By October 1944, the Japanese Southern Force was not meeting the American fleet of December 1941. It was not even meeting the American fleet of August 1942. It was meeting the accumulated result of everything those defeats had taught. Technology mattered. Formation mattered. Torpedoes mattered. But the largest American advantage was that the United States had been given almost 3 years to learn. Japan had not been given 3 years to replace what it was losing. Strip away the maps, the tonnage, the burning ships, and the phrase crossing the T, and Surigao Strait comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. Japan entered the Pacific War as the navy that understood darkness better. Its crews trained for night combat. Its destroyers carried torpedoes that outranged American expectations. Its commanders repeatedly used darkness to approach, strike, and disappear before American formations could react coherently. At Savo Island, that advantage helped produce catastrophe. At Tassafaronga, it crippled an American cruiser force even after American radar had given the United States the opening shot. Then the Americans changed the system. By October 1944, darkness was no longer an empty space between two fleets. It was measurable. Bearing could be measured. Range could be measured. Speed could be measured. Shell splashes could be measured. A battleship could engage something its crew could barely see because the target already existed as numbers inside the ship. And folded inside that reversal was a second one, quieter, that nobody noticed until it was already finished. West Virginia had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. California had been sunk there too. Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had been damaged. The battleships waiting across Surigao Strait were ships Japan had already attacked once. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not destroyed them. American shipyards had recovered them, rebuilt them, widened them, rearmed them, modernized their electronics, trained new crews, and sent them back across the Pacific. At 3:52 on the morning of the 25th of October, one of those ships fired 8 16-inch shells into the darkness. The first salvos straddled. The radar held the target. The salvos continued. 20 minutes later, the target was gone. The old battleship era ended almost exactly where the new electronic era became impossible to ignore. Mississippi fired one final salvo before the action closed. No American battleship would ever again fire its main battery at another battleship. Surigao Strait remained behind. So did Yamashiro. So did Fuso. West Virginia continued west. She bombarded Iwo Jima. Then Okinawa. After the war, she returned to the United States, entered reserve, and was eventually sold for scrap in 1959. The radar sets disappeared. The 16-inch guns went silent, and on the floor of Surigao Strait remained the ships that had sailed north, expecting darkness to conceal them. It never did. If you want to understand how America actually won its war, not the version in the highlight reels, subscribe. There's a new one every few days.